My daughter-in-law whispered over the phone, "Her room has that old people smell." That was the sentence that shattered my last illusion about family, and it was the beginning of a plan they never saw coming. My name is Clara Mayfield. I'm a 72-year-old widow from Portland, and they thought I was just a frail old woman, a burden to be managed until my inheritance came due. They were wrong. They didn't know that my carpenter husband had left me a legacy sharper than any insult, a will that would teach them the hardest lesson about greed and respect. If you believe that dignity has no age and that silence can be the most powerful weapon, then settle in and listen to my story. This house has no soul. That was my first thought every morning when I woke up in the basement guest room, where the rumble of Nicole's washer and dryer sounded like caged animals. Here in Bellevue, Washington, everything was polished to a sterile sheen. The marble floors were cold under my feet, even through socks. The walls were a shade of grayish my daughter-in-law called understated elegance. And the giant picture windows looked out onto a garden so perfectly manicured, it looked fake. My son Michael's house was a statement of success, but to me, it was a gilded cage. I'm 72, and I ached for the smell of pine wood and damp earth from our little house in Portland, Oregon. The house my husband, Walter, had fixed up with his own 2 hands, corner by corner. There, every scratch on the hardwood floor told a story, where Michael learned to ride his tricycle, where Leo spilled a jar of paint, where Walter and I danced in the kitchen on our 40th anniversary. Here, perfection left no room for memories. Every morning, I woke before everyone else, a habit from my nursing days. I'd go to the kitchen, a cathedral of stainless steel and white quartz, where everything was silent and efficient. I'd make a pot of coffee, even though I knew Michael would only have an espresso from his expensive machine, and Nicole started her day with a kale smoothie. I did it because it made me feel useful, if only for a little while. I'd wipe down countertops that were already spotless, arrange flowers that Nicole had bought and forgotten. I was a ghost in my own family, performing invisible chores. Breakfast was a dance of silence and distance. Michael, the boy I once read stories to every night, was now glued to his tablet, scrolling through stock tickers with a permanent frown. He'd become a successful financial director, but the warmth in his eyes seemed to have been replaced by numbers. "Morning, Mom," he'd say, his voice flat, without looking up. It wasn't a greeting. It was an acknowledgement of my presence, like one acknowledges a chair in the room. Nicole was different. She always smiled, the perfectly polished smile of a high-end real estate agent. "Clara, did you sleep well? Do you need anything?" she'd ask, but her eyes were already scanning past me to check if Leo, my 15-year-old grandson, was ready for school. Nicole's questions didn't require answers. They were part of the script for the perfect family she was directing. Only Leo was my small ray of hope. He had Walter's eyes, deep and observant. Sometimes, in the morning chaos, his eyes would meet mine over the table, and for a fleeting moment, I'd see a connection, a flicker of unease, almost a silent apology. But then Nicole would call, "Leo, hurry up, we're going to be late," and the moment would vanish. He'd grab a protein bar, mumble, "Bye, Grandma," and disappear out the door. I knew he loved me, but he was also afraid of his parents. That day, the tragedy began with a single sentence. I was on my way to the kitchen to pour a little more coffee into Walter's old ceramic mug. It was the only thing I truly treasured here. It had a small chip on the rim where his lips had touched it thousands of times. The glaze was faded with age, but it held the heat better than any of Nicole's designer cups. As I neared the door, I heard my daughter-in-law's hushed voice on the phone, probably talking to her sister. "I just don't know what to do. You can't imagine. The whole basement has that old people smell. It's awful. It gets into everything. I don't know if it's her medications or her perfume or just, I don't know, just the smell of being old. Michael pretends not to notice, but I know it makes the kids uncomfortable. I can't have friends over without feeling embarrassed. Each word was a shard of glass in my chest. I stood frozen, my hand clenched around Walter's mug. That old people smell? So that's what I was. I wasn't Clara, not Mom, not Grandma. I was a smell, an inconvenience to be aired out. My body trembled, not from sickness, but from a chill that ran down my spine. The mug slipped from my numb fingers. The sound of it shattering on the marble floor cracked like a gunshot in the silent house. Sharp, final, irreparable. "Is everything all right?" Nicole's voice called out, artificially cheerful. I took a deep breath, trying to keep my own voice from breaking along with the cup. "It's nothing, dear. I was just being clumsy. I'll clean it right up." I knelt, my old knees protesting in pain. I picked up the broken pieces of memory. This piece was the morning Walter joked about my bedhead. That one was him taking one last sip before heading to his workshop. This shard of white ceramic, now lying on the cold marble, was all that was left of 50 years of love. I had protected it, cherished it, and now it had been destroyed in a house that never welcomed it. Just like me. That night, I couldn't sleep. Nicole's words and the image of the shattered mug haunted me. The collapse of an illusion is always more painful than any hard truth. I had fooled myself into thinking that moving here was for the best, that I was being cared for. But now I knew I was just being warehoused until a more permanent solution could be found. In the early hours, while the house was still deep in sleep, I slipped into Michael's home office. The room was like the rest of the house, impersonally neat. But my intuition, the intuition of a mother and a nurse, told me where to look. There was a gray filing cabinet, and on the third shelf, a blue folder labeled simply, Mayfield Estate. My heart hammered against my ribs. I had come too far to turn back now. My hands trembled as I opened it. The first thing I saw was a copy of my will, the one I had asked Michael to hold for me. But it wasn't untouched. In the margins were my son's handwritten notes, cold calculations. Portland house sale, $520,000. Walter life insurance, $50,000, remaining $12,000. And at the bottom, in Nicole's red ink, minus expenses incurred, still a significant inheritance. Expenses incurred, so their kindness had a price tag. A wave of nausea churned in my stomach. But that wasn't all. Tucked in the back was a collection of brochures. Not for cruises or book clubs. They were for nursing homes. Sunshine Meadows, basic care, starting at $2,100 a month. Oakwood Assisted Living, Medicaid accepted. One of them, the shabbiest-looking facility, was circled in red pen. They weren't just waiting for me to die. They were planning for it. They had already picked out the warehouse. And then the final blow. Tucked between the brochures was a bank statement from my savings account. I squinted at the numbers. A recurring transaction made my blood run cold. Every month for the last 6 months, a transfer of exactly $1,000 had been moved from my account to Michael's. The memo line read, Family Expense Contribution. A contribution, such a polite word for theft. Michael had never asked me. I had never agreed. He had been quietly siphoning my money, taking advantage of my failing eyesight and a mother's blind trust. I sank into Michael's leather chair, the folders spilling onto my lap. The air in the room felt thick, making it hard to breathe. This wasn't carelessness. This was a calculated plan. A conspiracy orchestrated by the very son I had spent my life loving. The pain was so immense, it burned past anger and settled into a cold, hard clarity. I saw everything. I understood everything. And in that moment of raw truth, I remembered Walter. I remembered his quiet wisdom. Be careful with your heart, Clara, he used to say. You give it away too easily. Not everyone deserves it. I remembered his old safe, the one we had brought from Portland. Michael and Nicole thought it just held old land deeds and worthless photos, but I knew better. Walter was a careful man. He always had a backup plan. My hands were steady now, moved by a new purpose. I walked to the small safe hidden behind a landscape painting. The combination was our anniversary. 10/24/52. The heavy doors swung open with a soft click. Inside, lying on top of old papers, was a single ivory envelope, yellowed with age. My name was written on it in Walter's familiar script. Beneath my name, he had written a single line, a prophecy that seemed to reach from beyond the grave. For Clara, to be read when you need it most. I stared at the words. The tears I had held back all night finally came, but they weren't tears of weakness. They were tears of gratitude. Walter had known. Somehow he had always known the weakness in Michael's soul. He had foreseen this day. I sat in the darkness of Michael's office until the first gray streaks of dawn crept through the blinds, painting the sterile walls. The file was still in my lap, cold as a tombstone. But in my hands, Walter's envelope felt impossibly warm, as if he were right here, his hand over mine, giving me strength. My fingers, usually trembling, were surprisingly steady as I gently broke the seal. Inside wasn't a dry legal document, but a 4-page letter, written in Walter's strong, slanted hand. The smell of old paper and a faint hint of cedar from his workshop wafted out, a smell of home, of truth, of love. I began to read. My dearest Clara, if you're reading this, it means my greatest fear has come true. I hope with all my heart that this letter stays in the safe forever, never opened. But I know our son. I know he has the head of a financer, but not always the heart of a son. He sees the world in balance sheets, and I was afraid that one day you'd become a liability on his. I've thought a lot about this, Clara, about our legacy. It's not the house in Portland or the small savings we scraped together. Our legacy is the values we lived by, integrity, pride in the work of our hands. And I couldn't stand for that legacy to be cashed in and dissolved into fancy cars or Nicole's cocktail parties. So I did something. I spoke with our lawyer, Mr. Henderson, our old friend. You know how discreet he is. Our entire estate, the house sale, the insurance, the savings, is not in the account you and Michael manage. The moment I passed and the house was cleared for sale, it was all moved into a special trust, the Mayfield Family Trust. And here are the terms, Clara. I hope you can understand my decision. Term 1. Michael will not receive a single penny from this trust. The monetary inheritance is not for him. Instead, I leave him something more valuable, something he has abandoned, my entire workshop. All the tools, the blocks of walnut I was saving, and most importantly, my unfinished designs. It's his chance to find himself again. Term 2. There is a way for Michael to unlock the trust. I have left behind detailed plans for my final project, a cradle for our first great-grandchild. It requires the most complex joinery, curves that can only be made with patience and love. Michael must build this cradle himself within 1 year of you making the request. It must be made exactly to the design, with the tools in the shop. Mr. Henderson will be the judge. Term 3. If Michael refuses or is unable to complete it or produces a shoddy piece of work, he will have forfeited his heritage. In that case, the entire trust will be preserved and passed to the only one in the family I believe will know how to cherish it, our grandson, Leo. He will receive the full amount when he turns 25, with one condition, that he uses a portion of it to pursue an education or start a career that serves the community, something that creates real value, not just numbers on a screen. I'm not doing this to punish him, Clara. I'm doing this to give him a choice. The choice between easy money and a hard-earned legacy. The choice to remember that he is a Mayfield, and I'm trusting you to decide when and how to present him with that choice. All my love forever, Walter. I folded the letter and held it to my chest. The cold room seemed to fall away. I could feel Walter beside me, his arm around my shoulders. He hadn't just left me a plan. He'd left me a weapon, a shield, and a path forward. He had seen it all. The despair was gone, replaced by a cold, calm resolve. I knew now what I had to do. That day, I began my plan. I used the old tablet Leo had set up for me and searched for Willow Creek Estates. It was an independent living community for seniors. It had gardens, art classes, a small library. It even had a wood shop for hobbyists. The pictures of seniors smiling, talking, living, not just waiting, filled me with hope. I called them. A warm-voiced woman named Mrs. Albright answered. I explained I was looking for a change of scenery and would like a tour. Of course, Mrs. Mayfield, she said. We always love to meet new neighbors. Would you like to come by tomorrow? We have a one-bedroom apartment that just opened up with a balcony overlooking the rose garden. It felt like it was meant to be. The next few days were an act. I behaved as if nothing had changed. I still got up early, made the coffee, tidied up. I even feigned a little more tiredness, a little more forgetfulness, to reinforce their image of the old woman who needs managing. At dinner one night, Nicole said with fake concern, Clara, Michael and I were thinking, to help you manage your finances better, maybe you should give Michael power of attorney. He could pay your bills for you, so you don't have to worry. I looked at my son, who was nodding eagerly, and I just smiled gently. Thank you for your concern, dears. I'll think about it. Inside, I knew the account he wanted to manage was long since empty. The night before I planned to leave, I went to Leo's room. He was wearing headphones, coding something on his computer. He didn't hear me knock, so I stepped in quietly. I placed a small, cloth-wrapped object on his desk. Leo took off his headphones, surprised. Grandma? I have something for you, I said. Your grandfather made it a long time ago. He said he'd give it to you one day. Leo carefully unwrapped the cloth. Inside was a small sparrow, exquisitely carved from maple wood. Every grain, every feather brought to life. Its eyes were two tiny, polished black beads. It's beautiful, Grandma, he whispered, turning it over in his palm. Your grandpa used to say that sparrows don't have a fancy song or bright colors, but they always find their way home. They're strong and resilient, I said, resting a hand on his shoulder. Leo, no matter what happens, always remember who you are, and always find your way back to your true self. Don't ever let anyone tell you that you aren't good enough or that your dreams are silly. Leo looked up at me, his eyes smart and questioning. He knew something was up, but he didn't ask. He just nodded and clutched the wooden bird. I'll take good care of it, Grandma. The next morning, I was awake before the rumble of the washing machine. My bag was already packed. There wasn't much to take. A few changes of clothes, the photo albums Nicole had relegated to the basement, Walter's mug, which I had painstakingly glued back together, the cracks now looking like the veins of a leaf. And most importantly, I took the small wooden box that held Walter's finest carving tools. I had called a taxi the day before. At 6 o'clock sharp, the yellow cab pulled up at the end of the driveway, its headlights soft in the morning mist. I slipped out the back door with my small suitcase, making no sound. On the white quartz kitchen island, where no one ever sat down to share a cup of coffee with me, I left a note. I had thought long and hard about what to write. Not an accusation, not a word of resentment. My silence would be the loudest indictment. I simply wrote, Michael and Nicole, thank you for everything. I found a place that suits me better. Don't look for me. I walked out of that house and didn't look back. The crisp morning air filled my lungs, washing away the stale scent of deceit. As the taxi pulled away, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The modern, angular, cold house grew smaller and disappeared. 40 minutes later, we drove through the gates of Willow Creek Estates. It wasn't glamorous or luxurious. It was homey. Small, charming cottages were surrounded by tall pine trees and rose bushes still wet with dew. I saw a few people out for a morning walk. They nodded at the cab driver and smiled at me. Mrs. Albright was waiting for me in the office. She had silver hair and smiling eyes. "Welcome, Mrs. Mayfield," she said, shaking my hand warmly. "We have your room all ready. Let me show you." My apartment was on the ground floor, with a sliding glass door that opened onto a small patio. From there, I could see the rose garden she'd mentioned. The room was filled with morning sun, and it smelled of clean wood and lavender. "It's perfect," I whispered. After the cab driver helped me with my things, Mrs. Albright handed me the keys. "If you need anything at all, don't hesitate to let us know. Community lunch is at noon. Hope to see you there." She left me alone in my new space. I stepped out onto the little patio and took a deep breath. Birds were chirping in the trees. In the distance, I could hear laughter and the gentle clatter of tools from the direction of the community woodshop. I placed Walter's mended mug on the small patio table. The sun caught the cracks, turning them into shimmering gold lines. It was no longer perfect, but it was stronger in the broken places. Just like me. I hadn't run away from a home. I had come home, to my own. And from here, from this fortress of peace, I would wait. I would wait for the day my son received his true inheritance. My life at Willow Creek was like taking a breath after being held underwater for a long time. The tension that had been knotted in my shoulders began to dissolve. I woke to birdsong instead of a washing machine. I spent hours in the rose garden, my bare hands in the cool soil, a familiar feeling I had long since lost. I joined a watercolor class, discovering I had a small talent for capturing the color of the sunset in the treetops. I made friends. There was Esther, a former librarian with a razor-sharp wit and a dry sense of humor, and Sam, a retired engineer who could fix anything from an old radio to a broken heart. We ate lunch together, played cards in the evenings, and shared stories of lives well lived. For the first time in years, I was seen as Clara, not as Michael's mother or Leo's grandma. I knew my silence was causing a storm in Bellevue. About a week after I left, I received an email from Mr. Henderson, Walter's loyal lawyer. "Dear Mrs. Mayfield," he wrote, "as I'm sure you're aware, your son, Michael, has contacted me. He was, shall we say, distraught to find the accounts moved to the trust. I have informed him of the terms of Mr. Mayfield's will, as per protocol. He did not take the news well." A sad smile touched my lips. I could just imagine it. Michael, with the arrogance of a man who was always in control, suddenly finding he controlled nothing. Michael's first call came on a Tuesday afternoon. I was on my patio, trying to sketch a rosebud. His name flashed on the screen. I took a deep breath and answered. "Mom?" His voice was tight, like a wire. "Where are you? What the hell are you doing?" "Hello, Michael," I said, my voice calm. "I'm home." "Home? That godforsaken place is not your home. What did you do with my money? Henderson is talking about some crazy trust. Is this a joke? Did you conspire with him against your own son?" "I'm not against anyone," I replied. "I am simply honoring your father's last wishes. He left you an inheritance, Michael, a very valuable one." "A dusty old wood shop?" he practically yelled. "I'm a financial director. I don't need a pile of scrap wood. I need capital. You know the kind of pressure my firm is under." "Then perhaps you should get to work on your inheritance," I said softly. "Your father believed you could build something more valuable than capital." He hung up. The weeks that followed were a series of desperate attempts. Nicole called, her voice dripping with honey, trying to coax me to reconsider. "Clara, dear, we're so worried about you, all alone out there. What if something happens? Why don't you come home and we can all talk to the lawyers together, clear up this misunderstanding?" "There is no misunderstanding, Nicole," I said. "Everything is perfectly clear." They even had Leo call. I could hear them in the background feeding him lines. "Grandma," his voice was sad, "Mom and Dad said you're mad at us. I miss you." My heart ached. "I miss you too, my sweet Leo. I'm never mad at you. You can take the bus and visit me anytime you want. My address is—" I heard Nicole's sharp whisper on the other end, and the line went dead. They were using my own grandson as a weapon. That's when I knew they would never understand. And then, about 2 months later, the inevitable happened. It was a Saturday morning. I was in the community woodshop, safety glasses on, learning to use a lathe under Sam's patient guidance. The smell of freshly cut pine reminded me so much of Walter, it hurt. Suddenly, a car screeched to a halt in the parking lot. Through the dusty window, I saw Michael's gleaming black BMW. He and Nicole got out, their tailored outfits looking ridiculously out of place in the rustic setting. I switched off the lathe, took off my gloves, and walked outside. "Michael, Nicole," I said, my tone even, "what brings you here?" "We're here to take you home," Michael said, trying for a reasonable tone, but the anger was still thrumming underneath. "You can't live here. This charade has to end." "This is not a charade," I replied. "This is my life, a life of my own choosing." Nicole stepped forward, her arms crossed. "Clara, we've spoken to our lawyer. He says this will could be contested, that you may have had undue influence over your husband while he was ill." I let out a short, mirthless laugh. "Walter Mayfield? Influenced? You never really understood your father-in-law, did you, Nicole?" "Enough," Michael roared, his patience gone. "I'm not going to stand here and argue. I came to get what's mine. Henderson said if I finish some stupid cradle, the funds will be released. Fine, I'll build it. I'll get it over with. Now, where are the keys to the workshop?" His audacity was stunning. He had no intention of honoring his father's legacy. He saw it only as an annoying task to complete for a paycheck. "The keys are in Portland," I lied. "They're in a safe deposit box. I'll mail them to you." I would not have him walk into that sacred space with a heart full of hate. He would have to wait. He would have to want it, even if it was just for the money. A week later, I drove to Portland. I didn't mail the key. I wanted to face the past one last time myself. The old house had been sold, but the workshop remained at the back of the property, a small cedar structure Walter had built himself. I'd made an agreement with the new owners that the shop and its contents were part of my family's estate. I opened the heavy door. Everything was just as Walter had left it. The smell of wood, linseed oil, and thyme washed over me. Chisels were arranged neatly in their racks. A handsaw hung on the wall. On the workbench, a half-finished sketch lay under a fine layer of dust. This was his kingdom, a place of creation, patience, and integrity. And I was about to hand it over to a barbarian. The next day, Michael arrived. He drove straight from Bellevue, his face grim and impatient. He didn't even glance at the garden where he'd grown up. He walked straight to the workshop. I handed him the key. "Everything you need is in there. The detailed plans for the cradle are on the workbench." He snatched the key and went inside without a word of thanks. I stood outside listening to him rummaging around, to the harsh clang of metal tools being knocked about. My final confrontation, or rather Walter's, wasn't going to happen in a tense boardroom. It would happen in the science of that workshop. I didn't need to be there. Walter's legacy would speak for itself. I drove back to Willow Creek and waited. A month passed, then 2. I got updates from Michael in the form of short, angry phone calls. He complained about the drive. He cursed that the chisels weren't sharp enough. He said the designs were ridiculously complex. One day in late autumn, about 6 months after I'd left, I got a call from an unfamiliar number. "Mrs. Mayfield?" a young woman's voice asked. "Yes, speaking." "This is Sarah, your old next-door neighbor in Portland. I'm sorry to bother you, but I think you should come. It's about your son." My heart sank. "Is he all right?" "He's not hurt," she said quickly. "It's just, he's in the workshop. He's been there all day, and I can hear crying." I drove to Portland immediately. The sun was setting when I arrived, painting the sky in shades of orange and bruised purple. I walked through the familiar garden, the dry leaves crunching under my heat. The workshop door was ajar, spilling a weak line of light. I looked inside. Michael, my successful son, my dapper financial director, was slumped on the sawdust-covered floor. He was wearing an expensive dress shirt, now stained with grime and sweat. Around him lay pieces of ruined wood, mismatched joints, and forced curves. In the center of the room, on the workbench, sat something that resembled a cradle, but it was warped, clumsy, an insult to Walter's elegant design. He wasn't sobbing, but his broad shoulders were shaking, and his face was buried in hands that were raw from work he didn't know. The hands that typed in million-dollar figures were helpless against a piece of wood. I stepped quietly inside. He looked up, his eyes red-rimmed. "I can't do it," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "I tried. I watched you videos. I read books. But I can't do it." He looked at his own hands as if they belonged to a stranger. "I forgot everything. Dad taught me. He showed me so patiently. But I thought it was useless. I thought the numbers were the only thing that mattered." I went to him and knelt on the dusty floor, beside my 45-year-old son. I offered no words of blame. His failure was the only accusation needed. I just said, softly, "Your father didn't take your money, Michael. He just gave you a chance to remember who you are, to remember that you're not just a financial director. You're a carpenter's son." He broke down then, the sob of a man who has lost everything, not his money, but his respect for himself. He had failed his father. He had lost the best part of who he was. He could earn back millions of dollars, but he would never be able to build that cradle. That was the hardest lesson of all. Walter's legacy, in the end, was passed to its rightful heir. A few years later, when Leo went to college, he used a portion of the trust to study architecture, hoping to design sustainable homes for low-income communities. Sometimes, on the weekends, he'd drive to Portland, to his grandfather's old workshop. And there, under my guidance, he began to learn his first saw cuts, carrying on a legacy measured not in dollars, but in integrity, creation, and love. As for me, I found my peace. I never spoke to Nicole again. My relationship with Michael became distant but civil. He never apologized, but in his eyes, I saw a new respect that hadn't been there before. He had learned his lesson the hard and painful way. Sometimes in the late afternoons at Willow Creek, I sit on my patio, sipping tea from Walter's mended mug, and look towards the community woodshop. I know that a true legacy isn't what you leave for people. It's what you leave in them. And Walter's legacy, the legacy of a carpenter, had finally found its way home.